please mute your microphone and turn off your camera when not speaking. Second, feel free to turn off incoming video, as this may help if you have a weak connection. Thirdly, if you wish to speak during the meeting, please turn on your camera to indicate a wish to ask a question or make a comment. The chairman will be notified of all members who have switched their videos on. When the chairman does invite you to speak, please unmute. Finally, when voting, members will be asked only to indicate if they wish to vote against or to abstain from a vote. Where this is the case, the chairman will ask you to switch on your camera to indicate that you wish to do so. These will be monitored and brought to the chairman's attention. If you do not switch on your video, this will be taken as silent assent. Before I hand over to the chairman, for the benefit of viewers of the webcast, Katie Nellis, the Democratic Services Officer, will read the list of members in surname alphabetical order. Please turn on your camera and unmute to respond when your name is called.
Thank you, Mr. Britton. Good morning, everybody.
Right. Sorry, did you want me to do the list of members, Graham?
Chairman, Katie's just going to run through the list of members.
Okay. Councillor Clark.
Present.
Councillor Hall.
Present.
Councillor Hopkins.
Present.
Councillor Lambert.
Present.
Councillor Marland.
Present.
Councillor McCall.
I'm here.
Councillor McLean.
Present.
And Councillor Walsh.
Present.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. We go to the agenda, and the agenda item 1 is apologies. Do we have any apologies?
Katie, any apologies?
Has Katie gone?
There's no apologies, Chairman.
Thank you. We go to agenda item 2, and before I start, I understand there are some items that are matters arising from the previous minutes, and I will ask Mr. Britton to take us through those, and then we will then go to the minutes. So, Mr. Britton, would you like to take us through the matters arising from the last minutes?
Thank you, Chairman. As I understand it, under minute EX32, which relates to a very detailed verbal update provided by Area Commander David Norris, there are a couple of updates to provide the committee with. First, in respect of the debrief and the local resilience forum, I can confirm that that debrief was attended by officers of the authority, and that the Thames Valley Local Resilience Forum is preparing a report, and the outcomes will be considered by the service. Secondly, in connection with the Section 19 Flood and Water Management Act that's being compiled by officers of Milton Keynes Council, I can confirm that officers of the authority have contacted the Milton Keynes Council environmental lead, and input has been provided into that report. In connection with minute EX33 budget monitoring, on the bottom of agenda pack, page 11, there's reference to the Director of Finance and Assets evaluating a potential recovery of costs from the professional advisors, and I'm going to hand over to Mark Hemming to provide an update on that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Graham. Thank you, Chairman. So in terms of the potential legal claim, we're still evaluating the final account with the main contractor of the scheme. We've now agreed the majority of the work packages. The final ascertainment is now looking to finalise the value of the extension of time requests, and that will allow us then to evaluate the value of the legal claim, because obviously a lot of the claim we're kind of alleging is relating to poor timeliness of information provided by our professional advisors. The main financial impact will be in loss and expense. The final date for the final ascertainment is the end of next month. So once we've completed that, we'll then evaluate potential legal claim. And again, I'll continue to keep members updated in that respect.
Thank you, Mr. Hemmings. Thank you. Mr. Britton?
Chairman, there are no other matters arising from the open minutes that I'm aware of. There are some matters arising from the exempt minutes.
Are members happy that I sign these minutes then, having had those matters arising explained to us? And are you also happy for us to sign the exempt minutes? If you want to make a statement or ask a question on the exempt minutes, those exempt minutes will have to be taken in pink. So if you have no comments or questions on the exempt minutes, I'll take them as read and I can sign both. But if you do have comments, then we will put the exempt minutes to the end when we go into exempt session. So are you happy that I sign A, the minutes, and B, the exempt minutes? I take it there's nobody who's saying anything, so you're happy for that?
Chairman,
Yes.
I believe that Councillor McKay may have some questions in relation to the exempt minutes.
Okay.
So I would propose that we approve the open minutes and we then go into exempt session.
Thank you for that, Mr. Britton. So we'll sign the minutes that we have here. For the exempt minutes, we will do that later in the meeting. Thank you very much indeed. Are there any disclosures of interest? Yes, Mr. Felwell.
Chairman, as an officer, I need to declare that I'm a member. I and Mr. Osborne are members of the Firefighters Pension Scheme.
Thank you. And Mr. Osborne is going to claim the same then, yes? You'll disclose your interest in that as well. Thank you for that. Yes, Mr. Osborne?
I was just about to confirm my interest in that, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Do we have any questions?
None, Chairman.
Okay. We then go to agenda item 5, which is page 19 in your pack. And Stuart Gowanlock, the Corporate Planning Manager, will do the presentation. Councillor McLean, have you anything to add before Mr. Gowanlock takes us through the report?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good morning, members and officers. Given the events of the last year or so, members will appreciate the importance of maintaining a robust and up-to-date approach to identifying, evaluating and controlling risks that could potentially compromise our ability to maintain our services to the public. This update to our corporate risk management policy and guidance is therefore timely and welcome. As lead member for corporate risk, I have been consulted during its development and support the changes and updates to the preceding policy and guidance that are presented here. The document has also been reviewed by our colleagues in the Overview and Audit Committee, and they have recommended it to us for approval today. Before we consider the recommendation, I will now hand over to our Corporate Planning Manager, Stuart Gowanlock, who will provide an overview of the approach to the review and main changes to the policy and guidance. Stuart will also respond to any questions or feedback on the proposed changes that you may have. Okay, Stuart, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Councillor. So the last update to our corporate risk management policy was approved by this committee in March 2015. Although there wasn't anything fundamentally wrong with that policy, it had become overdue for review, and we therefore undertook to update it before the end of this financial year, hence its presence before you today. We've endeavoured to keep the policy and associated guidance fairly concise, so I will just draw a few things to your attention before opening up for any questions or feedback that members may have. Firstly, in terms of review and scrutiny prior to today, we have carried out consultations with key stakeholders, including the lead member, as Councillor McLean just indicated, prior to it being reviewed by our performance monitoring and strategic management boards in February, and subsequently by your colleagues on the Overview and Audit Committee at their meeting of last week, who have recommended it for approval today. As you will have seen from the cover paper, we have taken the opportunity of the review to look at recent good practice guidance from authoritative sources, in particular the relevant ISO, that's International Standards Organization, their standard, and use this to strengthen and supplement what was contained in the previous policy documentation. The policy has also been updated to reflect recent changes to our internal governance arrangements, particularly in relation to improvements to our project control environment, and also to bring it into line with current document protocols, so that there is now a short policy statement at Annex A, which is page 23 of your papers, followed by the more detailed guidance at Annex B, which is pages 25 to 37 of your papers. Updates and changes relative to the preceding guidance are shaded grey in the document. There are just a couple of things that I want to clarify in the guidance. At section 6.1, which is page 27 of your papers, you will have seen a structure chart showing the review points for corporate and project related risks via service boards and authority committees. With regard to this, we received feedback from the chairman, who suggested that this could be improved if we added arrows to indicate the upward escalation process through the structure. Unfortunately, it wasn't possible to amend the document at that point to include this, as it had already been published in readiness for the Overview and Audit Committee meeting. However, we have taken on board that suggestion and propose to amend the document accordingly following this meeting. You will have also seen that there is a section at page 29 of your pack, section 7, which sets out roles and responsibilities, including those of members. And notwithstanding what I've just said about the escalation of risks, whilst the flow is predominantly upward, there is nonetheless flexibility and scope for risks to be identified and introduced at any level, including by members, as indicated in the last paragraph at section 7.1 on page 29. Finally, my apologies, there are a few little typos that have been drawn to our attention in the appendices to the guidance notes at pages 35 to 37 of your papers. For example, at page 37, the number in the green box in the top left-hand corner of the scoring matrix should, of course, be 5 and not 1. Our apologies for these. Please rest assured that they will be corrected before the document is distributed within the service following this meeting. With that, I will now pause and take any questions or feedback that members may have before the committee considers the recommendation. Thank you.
Are there any questions for Mr. Gowanlock? No. Mr. Britton, will you read out the recommendation, please, on page 19?
Thank you, Chairman. The recommendation is that the corporate risk management policy set out at Annex A and the guidance at Annex B be approved, obviously subject to those typos being corrected.
And we're all in agreement?
Yeah. Chairman, no member has indicated a wish to vote against or abstain. That resolution is carried.
Thank you very much indeed. So the recommendation is carried, and thank you, Mr. Gowanlock, for your report and also for putting the corporate risk management policy and making it up to date and doing all those bits and pieces for us. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Chairman.
And also thank you, Councillor McLean, for your input. We now go to agenda item 6, which is on page 39 of your pack. And this is the Gender Pay Gap Report 2020. Councillor Lambert, have you anything to add before handing over to Faye Mansfield?
Chairman, just a very brief statement. Firstly, once again, thank you to Faye and to the team for everything to get this report here today. There's a lot of detail in the report, and I'm sure Faye is going to highlight a number of the key stages that we've gone through over the past year or so. This is a statutory that we have to publish each year, what our gender pay gap is. And it's a snapshot in time. You could argue that it's a crude measure that the government have imposed on industries over 250 employees. But what Faye and the team have done this year is taken a much more detailed look at the organisation, and the report reflects that, and the action plan in there I fully endorse and support. And I hope colleagues will do as well. So finally, thank you very much. Really good report. I highly recommend it to the committee, and hand over to Faye. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning. The Gender Pay Gap report is presented today with a recommendation for the content of the report being noted and approved for submission to the government's website as per annual reporting requirements in March. As a note, we were advised on the 23rd of February 21 that due to the continuing impacts of the coronavirus pandemic, the Equalities and Human Rights Commission announced that employers will have an additional 6 months after the current reporting deadline to report their gender pay gap information So all employers would have until the 5th of October 21 to report their gender pay gap information. Notwithstanding the suspension of the compulsory reporting of the gender pay gap for the second year, for openness and transparency, the intention is for this data for this authority to be published once approved and if approved by yourselves. As an organisation, the authority has a duty to carry out gender pay gap reporting and to annually publish 6 pieces of prescribed data about the pay and bonuses of male and female employees. The snapshot date for public sector employers is the 31st of March each year, and the data presented within the report, as detailed in Annex A, is based on data as at 31st of March 2020. The gender pay gap shows a difference between the average earnings of males when compared to females, irrespective of role or seniority. It examines the difference in the average pay gap expressed as a percentage of male earnings. It is important to note that gender pay gap is not unlawful, and the presence of a gender pay gap does not mean the authority is discriminating against groups of individuals. A gender pay gap is a reflection of a workforce profile at a specific time, i.e. the snapshot date. In comparison, equal pay is a legal obligation and about the unequal reward of male and females carrying out the same job, similar job, or work of equal values, as set out in the Equality Act 2010. An equal pay audit was undertaken for the authority during 2020, which confirmed the authority is achieving equitable pay between genders, and a separate report will be presented at a future overview and audit meeting on the equal pay audit that we carried out. So this is the 4th year of undertaking a gender pay gap reporting, and for 2020 the gender pay gap has increased by 3.7 percentage points to 18.8%. Whilst this is not as high as the first year reporting in 2017, where it was 19.4%, it is disappointing, and this increase takes the service 3.3 percentage points above the UK average gap, which is 15.5% at April 2020. And in comparison, for 2019, the service was, or the authority was 2.3 percentage points below the UK average gap. So in addition, for 2020, the service median gender pay gap has also increased by 4.9 percentage points, from 10.4% in 2019 to 15.3% in 2020. So the gender pay gap report has highlighted that the authority continues to have a gender pay gap. However, figures are not expected to reduce significantly within the short to medium term, and the issues driving gender pay gap reporting, gender pay gaps, requires a longer term perspective. The action plan detailed in Annex A, which is from page 57 within your pack, details the key areas of activities to lower the gender pay gap for the authority. And whilst the foundations for improvements have been laid through these initiatives and progress is being made, it will take several years before there is any significant impact on gender parity within pay for the authority. There will always be a number of contributory factors to why gender pay gap changes each year, and a couple of examples for this year or for 2020 would be that for the reporting period there's been a higher proportion of male workers working in senior positions and in the upper quartiles, and this is for the first year since we've reported, so this is since 2017, and there's been a decrease of females within the upper quartile, and this will directly affect the gender pay gap. There is also more opportunity for additional allowances and payments for operational employees when compared to support staff employees, for example, and our operational employees are a primary male-dominated part of the organisation. And for 2020, while both male and female hourly pay has increased, there has been a bigger increase for males, which has resulted in a pay gap of £3.64 or 3.7 percentage points. And this is the highest the hourly pay gap has been since reporting in 2017. So the authority will continue to strive to increase gender diversity in all areas of the organisation and will always strive to lower the gender pay gap. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I think also what is quite obvious looking through your report that you can't always do a percentage on apples and pears or oranges and lemons, and that's, is not particularly showing, and as you quite rightly pointed out, the difference in people's jobs and what the hourly rate is will make that difference in the gender pay gap. And we do know that the fire service is predominantly a male profession, not female, and that also doesn't help with the gender pay gap. Does anybody have any questions for Ms Mansfield? Right, Mr Britton, would you like to take us through the recommendation?
Thank you, Chairman. The recommendation is at page 40 in the agenda pack, and it is as follows: that the content of the Gender Pay Gap Report 2020 be noted and approved for submission to the government's website as per reporting requirements.
Thank you. And are we all in agreement with that? We have no people voting against that? No, the recommendation is carried. Thank you very much indeed for your report. And I know there's a lot of work has been done on that. It's quite obvious with all the figures and whatnot. So I do thank you for that. And also thank you, Councillor Lambert, for your input. So thank you, Ms Mansfield. Thank you.
Thank you.
We go to agenda item 7. And
Chair, before we go there, could I raise a point of information, please?
yes, of course you may, Councillor McCall.
We're about to go into exempt session, and when I joined the call this morning, there was a bit of banter with Councillor Douglas McCall. I would like to put on record my thanks for his term served on the Fire Authority. We didn't really get a chance to thank him at our last council meeting either, so I'm sure that on behalf of our group that we wish Douglas well in the future. He's been a great servant, and I felt that ought to be done before we went to exempt part of the meeting, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor McLean. I was actually going to do it at the end of the meeting, and obviously it's going to be in the public domain. But yes, I echo everything. And 25 years in service is a long time, so I do thank Douglas for all his input. As you quite rightly said, there was a little bit of banter about it before. Thank you for raising that.
I do apologise. I thought it, in case the local democracy reporter was on the YouTube, he might pick that up for us. And I do think, Douglas, that you've used the same picture for 25 years and you've worn very well.
Obviously,
you should see the painting in my attic. Thank you very much, Keith, for the kind words. And I remember working with you when I was a cabinet member before you were even on Milton Keynes Council. Around issues to do with Emberton Park. But thank you for the kind words.
And Ousdale School.
Yes, that as well. I've been around that long, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor McLean, and also to you, Councillor McCall, for all you've done and for what you've done on the fire service too, and the support that you've given. I think we probably all feel that being members of the Fire Authority, it's not only we are members of the Fire Authority, it's also an honour and a privilege to work with such a professional bunch of people. Absolutely fantastic. Right, Mr. Britton, will you please take us into agenda item 7? We've got to we've got Appendix C and Appendix E of the legal advice. Do members want to discuss or ask any questions on that? No? Okay.
Chairman, in which case, I think for the benefit of staff that might be watching the webcast, I think it would be beneficial to have as much of the discussion in public as possible. And if we go into a point where we do need to refer explicitly to the QC's advice, then I will ask the meeting to pause, and then I'll put the resolution at that point.
Okay.
May I also just say you've received the declarations of interests from the Chief Fire Officer and the Deputy Chief Fire Officer. There are no senior operational staff in attendance at this meeting who are directly affected by what is known as the immediate detriment guidance that's been issued by the Home Office, which will form part of the discussions.
Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Hopkins, before we go into agenda item 8, is there anything you want to add before the Director of Finance and Assets takes us through the report?
Just, Chair, thank you very much for the opportunity. I just want to congratulate Mark and the team on all the hard work that's gone into this. Chair, these are complex issues that the team are addressing, and I would point out that each case moving forward will need to be treated on its individual merits. I'd be grateful, Chair, once Mark has completed his opening remarks, if I have the opportunity to ask 2 additional questions of him. Thank you.
Mr. Hemmings, would you like to take us through this report, please?
Okay, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. As Councillor Hopkins says, this is an incredibly complex area of pensions. So the purpose of this paper is to present the latest legal advice which authorities received in relation to the Firefighters Pension Scheme Age Discrimination Remedy and the recent Employment Appeals Tribunal judgment. So it's a complex area. I'll do my best to summarise the background, advice and risks and the resulting recommendations that we're asking the committee to consider. So if I can perhaps start with the background. So the genesis for all of the changes in public sector pensions was part of the Lord Hutton review into public service pensions, which led to the Public Service Pensions Act 2013 and regulations made under that primary legislation. So there are a number of changes, but the primary legislation predominantly required the restriction of existing final salary pension schemes. However, within this, certain members could be protected and retain the rights to their previous scheme under what was known as transitional arrangements, which were done in order to protect those closest to retirement. So within the Firefighters Pension Scheme, there was protection to all members of the scheme who'd be 55 by the 31st of March 2022. It also allowed for tapered protection, which meant that members were protected in their original scheme on a tapered basis at a range of dates between the implementation in April 15 and the eventual ceasing of the old scheme in March 2022. And anyone who did not qualify for protection or taper protection were immediately moved into the 2015 scheme. A legal challenge was subsequently brought by the Fire Brigades Union on behalf of all members as to whether these protections constituted direct age discrimination and indirect race and sex discrimination. Now, this led to a number of legal challenges, which culminated in a Court of Appeal hearing in December 2018. Essentially, this found that the transitional protection element of the 2015 public sector pension scheme constituted unlawful age discrimination. I think it's also important at this point to point out that it's only the transitional protection that was unlawful. Moving all members to the 2015 scheme on the 1st of April 2022 isn't discriminatory. So in order to remedy the age discrimination, the government committed to launching a consultation, which it did so in 2020. I think it's important just at this point to note that the remedy period is defined as between the 1st of April 2015 and the 31st of March 2022. And the remedy only applies to members who are in service on or before the 31st of March 2012, on or after the 1st of April 2015, including those with a break in qualifying service of less than 5 years. So in advance of the consultation being issued, there was also something known as an immediate detriment guidance from the Home Office. So immediate detriment in this context refers to those who are due to retire in the very near future. This guidance should not be applied to scheme members that have already retired and are in receipt of their pensions payments. These cases are more complex to address, especially due to complexities relating to members' tax positions. And it's important also to know that all cases processed in line with the guidance will need to be revisited once the government's approach to removing the age discrimination has been finalised. And a number of these are subject to consultation and the legislation, and this is unlikely to be until after April 2022 and possibly as late as 2023 by the time legislation is laid. So the government consultation proposed 2 options for removing the discrimination between scheme members, and the 2 options were immediate choice, which meant that the members had to make the decision at a point in time now as to what they would want when they retire, or the deferred choice underpin, which means when they get to retirement, they then make the choice of which scheme they want to choose to be in for that remedy period. So members will remember that in October 2020, we brought our response to the Fire Authority to seek their views on the consultation and to inform that. We didn't give a view either way, we just set out the pros and cons of each approach. Subsequent to that, and subsequent to the initial Home Office guidance, some additional guidance was issued in October 2020, and that is in Appendix D of your packs. So this note is helpful to explain the UK government policy and shows progression from the previous policy. However, it does not cover all the steps that fire authorities and administrators will need to put into place to enact the guidance. And within the guidance that's issued, there's a statement that says FRAs now need to understand practically how they could give effect to the guidance. As the document notes in several places, it is informal guidance only. FRAs may wish to seek their own individual legal advice, and that is what we've done. So on the 12th of February 2021, the Employment Applied Tribunal gave a judgment in relation to a separate case which was brought, which alleged that fire authorities should have overruled the government legislation on discrimination. So we put forward what was known as a Section 22 defence, which is essentially in a nutshell saying all we did was apply government policy and we were had no other choice but to do that. However, that defence failed, and we're under Section 61 and 62 of the Equalities Act. We have a duty to overrule any aspects which are discriminatory, in this case, the transitional arrangements. Now, before this judgment was given, we had commissioned some legal advice jointly with Royal Berkshire following the Court of Appeal's ruling on the arrangements, and we were just waiting for judgment for the legal advice to be finalised, which has now been done. So as was discussed earlier, if members have any specific questions on the legal advice from the QC, we will need to take that in an exempt session. But in a nutshell, the legal advice is that Bucks Fire are now entitled to act on the basis of the judgment, and therefore we can rely on Section 61 and 62 of the Equalities Act to remove the discriminatory bit for those that are facing immediate detriment. And it's also just to confirm that since this paper was published, the LGA has decided not to appeal the ruling against the judgment. So as mentioned earlier, legislative changes will not be in place until after April 2022. So despite a number of uncertainties, it's imperative we take action now, because we want staff to be able to retire with the pensions that they paid for and have earned and are rightly entitled to. Just to highlight to members some of the risks of this approach, because I'd be remiss if I did not do so. Some of the guidance on some technical aspects still does not exist. In some cases, there may be insufficient information available to calculate the legacy benefits. If we were to do nothing, it risks further challenge by the FBU and/or other parties. Some of the issues that we're dealing with include how to recover employee contributions. Different schemes have different contribution rates, different definitions of pensionable pay, whether or not to apply interest, how to apply tax relief on contributions, what to do with cash equivalent transfer values, how to work out annual allowances, scheme pays, and all the associated tax issues. There's also some more niche issues as well, possibly including split pension entitlement, contribution holidays, divorce debits, etc. Notwithstanding all of that, I believe we have a duty to do the right thing for our staff and implement the recommendations that are being put forward today. In terms of mitigating some of these issues, we'll ask all members that are an immediate detriment and are affected by this to sign a declaration that they accept and understand some of the risks with this. Obviously, us and our pension administrators will use best endeavours to get it as correct as possible, but given that we don't know what the legislation is going to say exactly, there may or may not be some differences. So we make sure members are aware that although we're doing our best to calculate their actual entitlement, we may at some point in the future either have to come back to them for a repayment or come back to them to pay them additional money if they've been underpaid. So just to take members to the recommendations, because they're quite wordy, just put them in a nutshell. So as mentioned before, this legal advice was jointly commissioned with Royal Berkshire, and Berkshire have already approved these recommendations. But in a nutshell, what we're proposing is that any pension members that meet the criteria are now deemed to be members of their old scheme, deemed not to have left their old scheme. Any members that have not already tapered into the new scheme will now not taper into the new scheme until all members are moved into it on the 1st of April 2022. and that all affected members can receive benefits and be treated under the terms and conditions of their old scheme. So thank you for listening. I appreciate that's quite a lot to process, but I'm happy to take any questions that members may have.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Hemmings. I have one question. You mentioned that members of the scheme would have to sign a document. That won't preclude them from anything, will it? It won't be detrimental if they sign that document if things change going forward. Will that happen?
No, it won't prejudice them at all. All we have a duty to make members aware that we're using best endeavours to calculate it. We'll try our very best to make sure it's as accurate as possible, but it may be that there is a slight underpayment which we need to pay them in the future, or there may be an overpayment which we need to recover from future pension payments to be made to them, but it won't affect their position, and it allows them to access the benefits to which they're entitled now, rather than having to wait until legislation is laid, which may be a couple of years' time.
Thank you. And also, we will be helping them with pension advice.
To the extent which we're able to.
Yes.
The letter will also say we recommend they take their own independent advice, because we can advise on the administration, what certain things mean, but we can't be seen to be advising them on the best choice for them. They need to take that themselves with a qualified financial advisor.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Councillor Marland, do you have your hand up?
I do, and it's a follow-up to the question you just asked, Chair, around advice that's being given and advice that's received. Obviously, we live in a world where people don't always listen to advice, or perhaps advice isn't brilliant. And obviously, we've got a number of things at the moment. Payment protection was one of them. Mis-selling of diesel cars is another. And I suppose the question is, if we don't know all of the risk associated with this, and we are giving advice, even if the individuals were to seek independent advice, and I know you won't be able to answer this because in one sense we don't know the risk, but Mark, what could be the risk associated with people down the line saying, I signed this piece of paper, but I didn't know what I was signing because you couldn't possibly give me all the facts, and be at risk of challenge at that point, in the same way people were missold PPI, and also if people are going to have to maybe come back and make a decision in the future, are we going to give people any advice on what documents they may need to keep? Because I remember having to dig around in my attic for credit card statements that may or may not have existed around PPI. So making sure people are just made aware that, yes, you need to keep this, you need to keep your pay slip, or you need to do this, or you need to keep a record of overtime. Are we going to be providing that information?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think it comes down to the fact that we have to be very clear about we're not providing financial advice. We're not actually asking them to make a decision at the moment on which scheme they want to take benefits from. This is essentially being able to access the benefits which the kind of court has now said they're entitled to. So we'll obviously make sure that the pensions administrators keep all records. Record keeping is going to be massively important in this situation, especially with a deferred choice option, because we won't actually know until people retire which choice they want to take. So we'll have to keep records for both possibilities. So we'll make sure that all records are kept. And in terms of disclaimer, we've had it drafted by Adrian Lynch QC, which is the same person that drafted the advice which you've got in your exempt appendices. So we've taken expert advice on how best to draft that to protect both ourselves as an authority, but also to protect the individual pensions members, because it's important that they know all the risks that are involved in it. And as we said before, it's not going to be a detriment to them, because whatever it is, it'll be corrected in the future. What we don't want them to do is put themselves in a situation where they've spent all of their pension and then they may get a tax bill which they then struggle to pay. So it's making them aware of things like that, but actually what they're entitled to, they will receive. And when we revisit all cases, there won't be any detriment to them whatsoever.
Thank you. Councillor Hopkins, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. And as I said at the start of this particular item, this is incredibly complex,
Yes.
and I know how hard Mark and the team have worked on this. Mark, and you may have covered this to some extent, but you have mentioned a number of potential issues involved in processing immediate detriment cases. That in some cases it may not be possible to calculate benefits due under the old scheme. Could you give us an indication of which issues may lead to this situation and how you intend handling those cases?
Okay, yeah, I think as you kind of alluded to at the start, it's going to be very much a case-by-case basis on a lot of this. So it might be that a relatively straightforward example, a firefighter has been in the same role for the whole period of remedy. They've got relatively simple personal circumstances, and if they haven't changed roles, etc., it might be relatively simple, all things being equal, although there will still be tax issues to resolve and employee contributions issues to resolve. Compared to a more complex case, that is more doable. On the other hand, you could have someone that's changed roles a number of times, maybe entitled to a split pension, might have divorce debits, maybe a contribution holiday, maybe they breached that annual allowance in different schemes, they've got other pension outside of fire that's coming into it. A combination of all of those factors may just make a calculation unreliable, that we wouldn't want to be able to do that just because it would put too much risk on us and on the pension members. So in that case, they would have to be processed in the new scheme rather than the old scheme. I alluded earlier that we drafted letters to go to those that are using the old scheme benefits to highlight the risks. We've also asked the QC to draft letters setting out in cases where it's not possible to calculate the benefits in the legacy scheme, just kind of highlighting why we've not been able to do that, because firefighters, they all talk to each other. They'll know that some have been able to do it, some haven't been able to do it. So it's setting out the reasons why and just how we will remedy that in the future.
Councillor Hopkins, I think you had two questions.
Yes, I do, and thank you, Mark, very much for that. The second question, and again, you've alluded to this, but I just want to drill down a bit further. These recommendations don't apply to those who have already retired. So what is the process for ensuring those individuals receive the pensions to which they are fully entitled, please?
Okay, no, that's very correct. Yeah, the guidance says this cannot be applied at this point in time to those that have already retired and in receipt of pensions. Unfortunately, because they're no longer employees, it makes the tax situation even more complex, because there's things you can do with employees in relation to tax that you can't do with people that have left the service. So the advice at the moment is you cannot do it for those that have retired. We're aware that the FBU has recently raised a number of cases against authorities for not doing it for those that retired. They did a press release, and I'm paraphrasing slightly because I can't remember the exact words, but they're along the lines of they will sue every fire and rescue authority if pensions are not returned to their members as soon as possible. Guidance is coming out all the time, so we're keeping a close eye on guidance as and when it's issued. We recognise as employers that many of those receiving their pensions at the moment aren't getting their full entitlement, and that's something we want to correct as soon as we are legally able to do so. So it's something we're going to keep an eye on, and I envisage that we'll bring something to members in the future as the situation progresses.
Thank you. Councillor McLean, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, Chair. Mark, during your introduction to this item, talked about our pension administrator. Are we expecting to see any increase in the charges to the fire authority because of the added complexity that the pension administrators will have to undertake?
We haven't seen anything directly at the moment. We're still within the contract, so we're stuck with those contractual rates. We have said that there may be a situation where if recalculations need to be made, there may be an additional charge if new information comes to light and we have to change something like that. Longer term, potentially, because pensions is an area that is becoming more and more complex. More and more administrators are pulling out of the market, to be honest. Lots of other authorities have had to go and find new administrators at fairly short notice. because it is becoming a more and more burdensome area. So I think short term, the answer is probably no. Longer term, I think we will see cost increases in this area inevitably.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Councillor McLean. I have a couple of further questions on what you've been saying. Obviously, you're going to be meeting with all the members who of the pension schemes to explain fully what this means, and you'll be doing that across all the members that should be having their pension. You then mentioned that the QC would be writing letters to everybody. How will we ensure that those letters are going to be received by the relevant person, and that they should realise that that letter is very, very important and not, the usual one that you just sling in the bin? Another question is, you said as soon as possible, and in legal terms, as soon as possible can be forever, can't it? Do we know what the soon as possible time frame is? And have we taken on a pensions officer or somebody who understands the pension schemes to help the authority get through this time? Because it's extra work that's going to have to be done. I know we have a pension advisory service, but I can see the amount of work that this is going to bring forward in the future is going to be possibly colossal. And how are you going to actually ensure that you've got the, I don't want to say, the number of people in the staff to actually take this on, and also those that would have knowledge of the pension schemes? Because it's easy to say, yes, we've taken members of staff on, but they really do need to have pension knowledge, because it's not a simple, well, as we know, as we see, it's a minefield of, so how do we ensure that we protect everybody? That's really my question.
Okay, so just to address some of those questions, good questions. In terms of communications, we've got the benefit of, there's a limited number of cases that fall under the immediate detriment banner. I think we've got about 15. So we're able to kind of sit down and explain to those people on an individual basis to really emphasise the importance. It won't just be a letter that goes out. We can actually sit down face to face with them and say, these are the implications. We can talk them through the letter. As I said earlier, we can't advise on certain aspects, but we can certainly emphasise the importance of it. So it's not something they kind of just dismiss and then say, oh, we didn't understand what we were doing. We can definitely emphasise the importance of that. And it's something we've always done with pensions. We've had a number of kind of different things that have gone on over the last few years. We sit down, we explain to staff so they understand the implications of their decisions. In terms of what as soon as possible means, these recommendations that are in front of you today will be with immediate effect. So as soon as they're passed, anyone that wants to retire that's eligible using their old scheme benefits will be able to do so. The as soon as possible bit refers to those that have already retired. That's the bit we'll do as soon as we're able to do. But yeah, the bit today will be with immediate effect. And in terms of the pensions officer, we are shortly due to go out to advert for a pensions officer, which will be a joint collaborative role with Rural Berkshire. We work closely together. We work closely together on this legal advice. We work closely on a number of issues. We share the same pensions administrator, and having consistency across both services will be useful. So that advert is due to go out shortly. It's within existing budget. We've repurposed some vacant posts within the finance team to be able to fund that, because pensions is a growing issue. It's taking more and more time. So we've used existing efficiencies to be able to increase the work in this area. And that's due to go to advert. And yeah, it's kind of the criteria is to have the relevant public sector pensions expertise, because it is an incredibly complex area, as we've discussed and as you've seen from this paper. So it's important that we have that expertise just to further support staff to make sure we're doing it right to protect the authority, and also so that staff are getting the benefits to which they're rightly entitled.
You mentioned the 15 members of staff that are in this, in the cohort that are to retire. Do you know the numbers of members of staff that have retired that you're then going to have to now contact? and possibly members of staff that might have died during this time. Are the numbers huge?
I don't have those numbers off the top of my head. I imagine as it goes back to 2015, there's going to be kind of a fairly significant proportion to sort out. The ones that are closer to the 2015 will obviously have less service that's in dispute, and those ones are more likely to be fully protected if they're closer to that date. So there shouldn't be huge numbers. So hopefully, again, it'll be able to individual case-by-case contact, explain the situation, and hopefully, as I said before, look to resolve those ones as soon as we're able to do so.
It'd be interesting if we could actually have that number, just so that we're aware. We know we've got 15, and if it's another 15 or 20, it would be really good to know. Mr. Thelwell, you have indicated to ask a question. Do you want to ask a question?
No, Chairman, I haven't indicated to ask a question.
Oh, your hand's gone up a couple of times.
Oh,
I can see Mr. Britton's hand up. Don't worry, Mr. Britton, I can see yours. But I've just seen your hand flash up a couple of times, Mr. Thelwell. I thought you wanted to ask a question. Mr. Britton.
Chairman, if I can just go back to an observation that you made, and I just want to make it clear for particularly those affected firefighters, it won't be the QC that's writing to those affected firefighters. The obligation is on the employer. Mark mentioned that it's the QC that's drafted the appropriate letters for Berkshire and for Buckinghamshire. I didn't want to our employees to think that a QC will be writing to them, and because obviously that could create some anxiety. But no, we've had assistance in the wording of those letters.
And so they're proper and legal. Thank you. Okay. No further questions. Mr. Britton, would you like to take us through the recommendations, please? And they're on pages 69 and 70. Could you take us through, and then we'll ask members if they're in support, vote against, or abstain or support.
Thank you, Chairman. Sorry, thank you, Chairman. The recommendations have been carefully drafted to reflect the findings of the EAT judgment. So they are quite wordy, but they've been carefully drafted, and they are as follows. The recommendation is that the Executive Committee, on behalf of the authority, which is the scheme manager of the authority's firefighter pension scheme, does the following. First, note the contents of the report. Secondly, resolve that all firefighters who were members of the Firefighters Pension Scheme 1992 or the new Firefighters Pension Scheme 2006, i.e. their old schemes, who A, belonged to those schemes at the 1st of April 2012, and B, continue to do so on the 31st of March / 1st of April 2015, and who did not qualify for full protection from being transferred into the 2015 pension scheme under the Public Service Pensions Act 2013 and the transitional regulations made thereunder, and D, who have been transferred or are liable to be transferred at the end of their tapered protection into the new 2015 scheme, are now deemed to be members of their old schemes, and if still on tapered protection are no longer liable to be transferred. And 3, resolve in regard to those who were transferred into the 2015 scheme and are not still on time-limited tapered protection from such a transfer, they are deemed not to have left their old schemes as a result of any compulsory transfer. And finally, 4th, resolve those members now deemed to be restored into their old schemes as set out above, or no longer liable to be transferred out of their old schemes as identified above, are to receive pension benefits under and are to be treated as being subject to the terms of their old schemes.
Are there any abstentions? Are there any people voting against those recommendations?
Chairman, there are no indications. The resolutions are passed.
Thank you. I therefore say that the recommendations are carried. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Mr. Hemmings, for a very comprehensive explanation of this. It is a complex agenda item, and also Councillor Hopkins for your input too. Thank you. Right, agenda item 9 is exempt minutes. Mr. Britton, will you take us please into exempt?
Thank you, Chairman. The recommendation is that the public and press be excluded from the meeting by virtue of paragraph 3 of part 1 of Schedule 12A of the Local Government Act 1972, as the minutes contain information relating to the financial or business affairs of a person, including the authority, and on these grounds it is considered at this moment in time that the need to keep the information exempt outweighs the public interest in disclosing the recommendation. Chairman, that is the recommendation. I'll just wait to see if any members wish to vote against or abstain. Chairman, there are no indications of a member wishing to vote against or abstain. That resolution to exclude the press and public is passed. We'll just wait for a moment, unless you have any final words, Chairman, before we go into exempt session.
Yes, I would like to just express our thanks to Councillor McCall for all his hard work on the authority before we go into exempt, and I do thank you for what you've done, and we wish you all the best for your future, which I'm sure you will find that you'll be busier than ever, but I'm sure that you will enjoy your retirement, because I'm sure you've got lots planned to do, and once we're out of lockdown I think that will happen, but please do enjoy it, and I thank you sincerely for what you've done and for the support that you've given the authority. I don't know whether Mr. Lambert would like to say something, or Mr. Marland, or Mr. Hopkins.
Chairman, thank you. If I may just say a couple of words. I've worked with Councillor McCall for a number of years and on various different projects inside and outside of the Fire Authority. I would say that he's always approached the role with absolute diligence. And there are some times I took a sharp right turn to think, well, where did that come from when he says something in committee? But it absolutely is well thought through, professional and considered. And I think we're going to really miss him on the authority, miss his insights and support. It's been a pleasure working with him, and I wish him all the very, very best for the future, and for his wife, Isabel, who's also a good friend of mine also. So, Douglas, congratulations on your release. Enjoy your retirement. Thank you.
And dare one say, our commiserations to your good lady, because you're going to be at home all the time. I know you have been at home all the time in lockdown, but even more so now. Councillor Hopkins would like to say something.
Well, just very briefly, if I may, Chair. I mean, I've known Douglas for certainly for all of his 25 years, and probably for many more before. And I can just say that in another place at Milton Keynes Council, he's one of those councillors where when he stands up to speak, remember the days when we used to stand up to speak,
Yes.
everybody would stop and listen, because he became one of the, and I mean this in the right sense of the word, one of the big beasts in the council. Not only as leader of his group, but also to offer a sensible, balanced, well thought through argument on whatever the issue being discussed may be. I didn't always agree with him, but I never disagreed with him violently. And I do consider him as friend, as I do his good lady wife. And I look forward to seeing him around even after he leaves us from the council and from the Fire Authority.
Thank you, Mr. Hopkins. Councillor Hopkins. Councillor Marland.
Just to echo those comments, really, Douglas has been a very strong councillor, not least for Newport Pagnell, as he never tires of reminding me when we have our one-to-ones on Milton Keynes Council. It's always Newport Pagnell that comes first, and he will be missed, not just because, as Councillor Hopkins says, he brings that sort of sensible balance to any discussion, and I'm sure he'll enjoy his retirement in the pleasant surroundings that he's going to avail himself of.
I'm sure he will. I'm sure. Thank you very much indeed, Councillor McCall, for what you've done.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, members who've said something. Mr. Britton, we're now in exempt, I believe.
Chairman, we'll